Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Second episode of the Maritime Matters podcast, where we talk about the last week in maritime affairs that impact Australia. What have you been up to in the last week?
So I've been trying to do a bit of digging, thinking about some of the new technologies and things that have been playing out in the maritime space for a little while, and trying to do some writing on that and thinking about how particularly things like land power and sea power and how they change. So what I've been doing is digging back into the archive, and I've particularly enjoyed reading Samuel Huntington's seminal article from the 1950s about transoceanic navies. So that's been my fun and excitement for the week. How about you?
I was in Japan last week, actually, with CIPRI, talking about Indo-Pacific naval dynamics and some of the capability enhancements that are occurring across the regions. And speaking of capability enhancements, I think we'll get to it later in the podcast, but there has been some interesting developments, particularly in missile capability.
Absolutely.
But I guess before we get to that, so I guess, what's been happening in the South China Sea?
So there's been quite a bit of sort of action or at least reporting of things. So one of the things that's been flagged in a number of different outlets and sort of discussed is the idea that China is now permanently stationing a couple of warships in Cambodia. This has been something that people have been following, and there's been a bit of discussion about for a little while. But new satellite imagery and some sort of further confirmation has been coming through that these couple of warships appear to be stationed there permanently. And there's been some sort of further indications that this is perhaps a sort of permanent Chinese base. The fact that Cambodian ships are not using the same facilities, and recently when there was a port visit by a couple of Japanese destroyers, again, they weren't given the same kind of sort of taken to the new facility built. And so all of this is leading people to suggest that there is actually a significant new naval facility being built or has been built in Cambodia specifically for the PLAN, which is really interesting in terms of the kind of the shift that the PLAN is sort of undertaking. Obviously, they've had a base in Djibouti for a little while.
I thought this reporting was really interesting too. So you mentioned China's base in Djibouti, obviously established in 2017. But part of their rationale for establishing that base was that they were resupplying their counter-piracy task forces, so doing a common good. But the question about whether there is a base at the Ream naval base in Cambodia, I think, is a completely different conversation. Obviously, the Ream naval base in the Gulf of Thailand has a lot of access to the Malacca Strait. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative looked at satellite imagery for the last 4 months, and it is pretty clear that the new pier that's been built, most likely from Chinese funding, has only been used, as you mentioned, by Chinese corvettes, who appear to have been basically alongside for 4 months, which is interesting. And, I was reading the 2019 Wall Street Journal article, which at first highlighted the fact that China might be establishing a base in Cambodia. And at the time, the Cambodian government came out and said, we don't allow foreign bases. And, I was thinking I was in a roundtable with a Cambodian think tank late last year, and they were saying, it's China's assisting us with funding a training base. So it has been, I think, quite an interesting development.
Yeah, and it certainly has implications in terms of up until now, Chinese bases have been seen as being being sort of relatively isolated from mainland China and easily isolated in terms of any sort of conflict type scenario. This is a very different type of facility, and whether it be in a sort of coercion and competition environment or even potentially in a conflict environment, it certainly begins to change some of those dynamics. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. What else has been catching your attention in the region this week, Jen?
Well, so not well reported on in Australia, but the Western Pacific Naval Symposium actually occurred last week in China, um, which the Australian Chief of Navy attended alongside the US and, in fact, the First Sea Lord. So I thought that was quite interesting. Australia doesn't seem to have official defence ties with China at the moment, so that was an interesting development. In terms of the outcomes of what was the 39th iteration of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, it's not clear what the outcomes were. There's some Chinese reporting that there was an agreed update to Qs, which is the code for unplanned encounters at sea, which we'll talk a little bit more about in this podcast. One of the things I thought interesting, only in the Chinese reporting about the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, was potentially an agreement amongst the heads that attended so that's the chiefs of navy and equivalents that attended, about some sort of workshop or agreement or work towards the standing and confliction on uncrewed surface vessels, which I thought was interesting. It was only 10 years ago. In fact, it was actually in China 10 years ago that the code for unplanned encounters was actually signed.
It's certainly been notable also how, looking at over that 10 years, the significant change in relationship that has taken place, and how it almost seems quite surprising in some ways that you're seeing the number of chiefs of navy and the sort of significant attendance in China. And certainly it was quite remarkable hearing of bilaterals between the head of the Australian Navy and the head of the Royal Navy taking place in China. Certainly not something that I think many people had on the bingo card for this week. But yes, certainly, again, worth keeping an eye out in terms of whether those outcomes, there's anything more concrete on that, because it would certainly be a really important development in terms of additions to queues. But I continue to harbour a few doubts until we get something a bit more concrete on that one.
I think it's unlikely too. I was doing some reading about the genesis of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. It began in 1988 and actually began in Australia. So the then Chief of Navy, you impressed by my naval history here, Richard, Admiral Hudson had actually pushed the idea. So Australia and China and a couple of other countries were founding members of WPNS. And it was all about coming together to try and work out ways to work together. And through its iteration, not only has it come up with cues, but there was a RAS guide produced by Malaysia on replenishment ships in the region and how we could work together. So there's been a lot of iterations, but it has tended to try and focus on non-state threats, whether that be piracy. There's been a lot of iterations where there was thought that there would be focused on humanitarian aid and disaster relief. But as you say, I think it was really interesting to see the significant attendance at last week's WPNS in China. I think they said over 180 delegates, and we mentioned the Australian Chief of Navy, Commander of PAC Fleet, and the First Sea Lord. Just goes to show that despite the fact that there's probably less of a chance of Western Pacific Naval Symposium countries actually working together on maritime security issues, there is still an emphasis on it in terms of it as a dialogue.
Yeah, and it's obviously an area where, in terms of sort of dialogue, there's been some real challenges recently. So it's good to see continued buy-in, and hopefully, our skepticism, or certainly my skepticism, will be proved wrong. But we'll have to wait and see with that one. There's been some other important or sort of interesting developments, starting in terms of exercises. Really important, sort of primarily bilateral American exercise or American-Philippine exercise, Balikatan. I always have to check my pronunciation on that one, which is, as I say, it's originally at least a bilateral US-Philippine exercise, but now includes a number of other players. So there's Australian contingent there. Interestingly, I saw there's a French contingent for the first time this year. Obviously, there's quite a heavy focus on sort of South China Sea elements within that. So it's not apparently quite as big as last year's exercise, but again, a significant kind of development there. And something, again, that we'll have to sort of see in terms of the continued signalling and support that the United States and others are showing to the Philippines with the sort of continued the pressure that the Chinese are putting on Second Thomas Shoal and elsewhere. And this comes hot on the heels of engagement with the Americans, the Japanese, and the Philippines only, last week or 2 weeks ago. So I think there's a real concerted effort, and I think it's really good to see this sort of continual cycle of allies and sort of like-minded partners all engaging with the Philippines. So that's certainly something that's good to see, and I think we'll see a little bit more about that exercise and what actually is going to take place in the reporting over the next couple of weeks.
So I think from something I read, and if anyone here is a Balikatan exercise planner, don't quote these figures back at me, but somebody said about 16,000 troops, which you think about the initial iterations of Balikatan, which began during the Cold War, which was just a bilateral between the US and the Philippines. That's pretty significant. Some of the readouts from the Philippines about it talk about integration of cyber warfare, information warfare, and also the focus on Palawan and Luzon really shows that is pivoting towards an exercise that's very much focused on South China Sea scenarios. Yep. So it's certainly evolving.
Yeah, and last year, I think it was last year, or my memory might be tricking me here, but you were beginning to see some sort of significant SYNCEX and other deployment of quite sort of substantial both American capability, but also building in Philippine capability, and we'll be talking a little bit more about some of that towards the end of the podcast.
Richard, what's really struck you in terms of capability in the last week?
So one of the ones that I think we've both been following for a little while has been PBAT, Patrol Boat Autonomous Trial, in which one of the sort of recently decommissioned Australian or Royal Australian Navy patrol boats was handed over to Austal and converted into a they undertook a lot of work to try and get it into a fully autonomous vessel. That trial, I think, if I'm reading and understanding it right, that trial has now fully completed and come to an end. And they released Austal at least released a bit of a statement with some more information on it. It's certainly something, as I say, that we've been looking at for a little while. So it's really interesting to see that they've managed to do it. I understood there may have been a few technical issues and problems along the way, but that has seemingly worked both in terms of the engineering side of things and the software side of things. So that's really good to see. There was also some quite interesting detail come out that certainly I hadn't picked up on before about what they were trying to get out of it, because this is by far the largest autonomous or uncrewed platform which is operating in Australian waters under Australian regulations, so slightly different to obviously the American vessels which came into Sydney at the end of last year. But one of the things that really caught my eye was a discussion about trying to drive an increase of autonomy inside the crewed fleet. So we obviously know and hear a lot about challenges in terms of personnel. And a little while ago, there was a lot of focus, both in the US and elsewhere, on what was then described as minimal manning and trying to reduce crewing components in crewed ships. That's kind of slipped a little bit, certainly in terms of focus recently. So I thought it was really interesting to see that flag back as another potential. And obviously, we know that this is an area where the RAN is putting a huge amount of focus. So again, good to see the success of the trial, and keen to sort of find out a little bit more if any more comes out, but also see what happens next. Where do we go from here?
I was equally kind of interested. In 2022, it was announced with a bit of fanfare that HMAS Maitland, one of Australia's patrol boats, so 57-metre-long patrol boat, would be decommissioned and given to Austal effectively to be turned into the boat they called Sentinel for this trial. But there wasn't much about the trial, and it wasn't clear whether it was still happening. Obviously, we know from the Defence Strategic Review and the recently released National Defence Strategy that moving into autonomous vessels is certainly a focus, but it wasn't clear what was happening with this patrol boat. So it was interesting to see Austal's announcement kind of completing the project. Austal highlighted that they were also working with Green Room Robotics. I think there was trusted autonomy systems in there as well. Obviously, the Royal Australian Navy Warfare Innovation Branch. And they said in it, which was probably the most information I'd seen on it, that they had extensively modified the navigation, communications, bilges, CCTV, and electrical systems to try and work out how they can make more things autonomous. So I think, look, it does seem like it's wrapped up. I agree with you. It was interesting to see that this might be some lessons learned for how we minimise crewing in some of the current fleet or future planned fleet. But I think it's also something that probably puts Austal in a prime position for the future development of the large, optionally crewed, which surface vessel to come to Australia. We're building 6 of them from the mid-30s. So if nothing else, it sets Austal up to be very competitive for that, I suspect. Now, on the point of autonomy, I do need to have a correction. So last week we were talking about the fact that the National Defence Strategy called out investment into the Blue Bottle, which is an Australian capability. But I said it was Blue Zone. It's actually an OCS capability. So check out that capability, and good to see it mentioned in the Integrated Investment Plan. What else is happening in capability?
So we've seen a couple of interesting missile developments. The one that I was sort of really interested in was the delivery of the first Brahmos anti-ship missiles from India to the Philippines. So the Philippines have acquired these the sort of relatively newly developed Indian anti-ship missiles. Interesting in a number of different ways. Obviously, this is a significant step up in capability for the Philippines. The nature of the region we're talking about, this is very much sort of South China Sea. We're talking, obviously, quite a lot about the Philippines in terms of their sort of issues they have with the Chinese. So in pure capability terms, this is a really interesting kind of development. But I'm also really intrigued by both the degree to which these sorts of weapons, so this is ground-based anti-ship missiles, are kind of to a degree proliferating. So we're seeing more and more of these sorts of things being deployed in the region, and also being deployed to or being acquired by different countries to perhaps where you would normally have seen them or previously have seen them. And the really interesting one as well from my perspective here is about who's creating or who's building this kit and who's selling it. So if we sort of look longer term, generally speaking, you look at these type of relatively high-end weapon systems, you get the Americans, you've got the Europeans, and you've got the Russians, and okay, the Chinese probably have got their own domestic production, but often with Russian roots. But you're beginning to see what might be seen as a kind of a democratization of a lot of this technology, both in terms of who's building it and in terms of who's using it. And I think that's a very interesting trend. Again, something that we're sort of seeing elsewhere a little bit, but this is a really noteworthy example of that.
I think the Brahmos, I've seen reporting that potentially Thailand and also Indonesia are talking to India about acquiring the Brahmos. And obviously, originally the Brahmos, an interesting design itself because it was a joint collaboration between Russia and India. Although Russia seems to be dropped from all the press releases about the sale of the Brahmos to the Philippines. But one of the interesting things, I think, in terms of the Philippines' capability, so it sounds like they've ordered a couple of batteries for their Marine Corps, and what was delivered last week was a battery for their Marine Corps, and 3 batteries for their Army. And so their Army have traditionally been focused more on counterinsurgency operations. But I think the sale of the Brahmos to the Army is showing a real transition of their Army to a strategy of territorial defence. So a lot more focused on the South China Sea than their Army has traditionally been. Another thing that's interesting is when you pull out a chart and you plot the range of a Brahmos, which it looks like the export version is about 290 kilometres. The reporting is that the Indian version is 450 kilometres and they're working on extending that to 900 kilometres. But probably what the Philippines has acquired is about 290 kilometres. But even then, that is a capability where they could reach out and touch both Scarborough Shoal and Mischief Reef. So it does start to change the dynamics, I think, a little bit in the South China Sea in terms of what we're seeing. And we'll even do so more if it looks like, Thailand and Indonesia do acquire that capability. But not the only significant missile development in the last week. There was another one, Richard. Do you want to talk about it?
Yep. So a similarly if we're thinking about these kind of things as looking at increasing numbers of ground-based missiles which are being deployed to this region and beginning to reshape the dynamics, the deployment of the first American Army, what is officially referred to as the mid-range capability, which is a particularly snazzy and exciting title, and is either described as the Typhon or the Typhoon, and I'm not entirely sure which. I've seen both spellings, either with one O or two, but who knows? Anyway, it's basically a ground-based battery on effectively 3 or 4 lorries, which can fire either Tomahawk land attack missiles or SM-6, which are primarily long-range air defense missiles, but can also be used to target surface vessels, for example. So this is a very significant step up in terms of the American Army capability to do exactly the sorts of things that you're talking about. And these are being... so this is the first time they've gone overseas, as far as I'm aware, certainly. So they're in the Philippines at the moment. I think it's just the one battery. And whether or not they are going to take part in Balakatan, what I've read so far suggests probably not. But there isn't anticipated; it is planned to be sort of test fired later on this year. So really interesting development. Particularly, again, you're talking about sort of plotting ranges out. You're talking there about sort of 290 kilometers. Obviously, something like a Tomahawk land attack missile, you're talking 1,200 miles, potentially out pushing towards sort of 1,800, 1,900 kilometers. So again, thinking about exactly the sorts of things that you were discussing earlier about changing that dynamic in the South China Sea and around there, these type of capabilities will have a significant effect. Whether or not there are plans to include and I would assume that there are, but the new replacement maritime targeting block of Tomahawks as and when they come out, and I think that's supposed to be this year. You might know more about that than I do, but there's obviously then a further step up in that kind of capability.
What else has been happening in capability?
So the other one that flagged with me is the HMS Diamond has been added onto the list, the growing list now of warships that have successfully engaged anti-ship ballistic missiles. So obviously the Americans have been very much leading the way with this. The French frigate Alsace successfully has been engaging a couple of these sorts of things. So far, up until last week, the Royal Navy's been very effective at taking out drones, but this is the first time that we've seen the Type 45 destroyer and the Sea Viper missile successfully engage an incoming ballistic missile. So again, this is further to what we were talking about before in terms of ballistic missile defense and some of the sort of perhaps now it appears overblown concerns about the fact that all warships are now incredibly vulnerable. You're now seeing a range of different missile systems, a range of different sensor systems, all being quite effective, certainly at targeting the short-range ballistic missiles that have been supplied to the Houthis by Iran.
I think this is really important too for our region. For a long time, there's been a lot of consternation about China's missile capabilities, and should a conflict occur in the Indo-Pacific region, there's been a lot of commentary that surface ships would not survive. And what we've actually seen through the Red Sea is that, yes, they have lots of limitations, including their magazine capacity. And we mentioned last week that, the fact that Certainly the Australian Navy, the US Navy, the Royal Navy do not have the ability to replenish missiles at sea. But what we are seeing is the ability to defend against anti-ship ballistic missiles, which for a long time people said was not likely and would be a real challenge in the South China Sea. I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but I think it is interesting to see that the warships deployed into the Red Sea are demonstrating that they do have this capability. And, it'd be exciting to see the Australian Navy upgrades that are coming, certainly mentioned in the Independent Analysis Team's Surface Combatant Fleet Review, that the intent was to expedite the Hobart class getting Aegis Baseline 9 and SM6 integrated into them. So it has been a pretty big week in the region, which again shows that Maritime Matters, we will definitely get sick of that, I suspect.
Oh, never.
But lots of developments from the Western Pacific Naval Symposium to potential Chinese basing in Cambodia to exercise Bala-Katan to lots and lots of capability developments. I guess on the Did You Know today, I thought we'd talk about the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, CUES. So CUES, I think we mentioned earlier, agreed by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium actually 10 years ago, so in 2014. It's interesting, though, when you read the history. In the early years of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, yes, I do read some history, not as much as you, I'm not a geek. In the early 90s,
Really?
In fact, Australia was really pushing for WPNS to adopt something like CUES, which is effectively information for ships about how they could deal with other ships when they come across them. So what do certain signals mean? How do they communicate? What should they avoid doing, etc.? Unclassified document that is on a volunteer basis. And in fact, its early iterations, there was a lot of singing and dancing about a 2014 exercise between a US ship and a Chinese ship in the Western Indian Ocean doing counter-piracy operations, exercising CUES. And there was another example in 2015. And certainly it's been a useful example to show ships how they could work together and coordinate and communicate. I think there's a comms plan in it even in the South China Sea. But one of the criticisms is that it's only contained to naval vessels, so it does include Coast Guard vessels. Obviously, we've seen a huge development in the use of Coast Guard vessels in South China Sea for what would always be deemed military operations, certainly in the vicinity of Second Thomas Shoal. It does include autonomous vessels, so the develops around uncrewed surface vessels, for example, and it does include submarines. Now, there was a push by Singapore around 2016, 2017 to include submarines into it. It was called UQs, I think, but it's never really been adopted. There you go. Richard, any comments on CUES?
No, I think CUES gets a bad rap a lot of the time. I, of course, being a historian, immediately connect it back to sort of INCSEA, the Incidents at Sea Treaty, which was developed by the Soviets and the Americans after a couple of incidents in the late 1960s and signed in 1972. INCSEA wasn't perfect. Lots of issues. There's some wonderful photographs of Soviet and American ships engaged in shouldering, or generally Soviet ships shouldering American ships, so basically crashing directly into them. But most people broadly think that INCSEA did some good and did provide at least some sort of framework and rules of the game. And I think that you can probably see CUES in a similar light, although it's not a legally binding treaty in quite the same way. So I guess I would perhaps be on the more positive side of CUES, unlike those who sort of try and belittle it, and certainly there are many flaws, but I think it serves a useful purpose, and I think it'd be great to see it expanded to uncrewed platforms, although, as I say, I have my doubts.
Look, I have my doubts too, and I think it certainly was a really good development. One Australia should be proud of as having led the way, as it has in WPNS. I think the difference, though, between CUES and INCSEA is INCSEA was something that had political agreement, whereas CUES is more of an operational level agreement, and I'm not sure it has the same ramifications politically if it's not complied with. In fact, some of the stuff we're seeing with Chinese naval vessels, and we look at the Toowoomba incident in November last year, for example, where a Chinese destroyer approached Toowoomba, who was conducting diving operations. Q's is very clear about what flag alpha means, which for those of you that aren't in the Navy, means I'm conducting diving operations. And yet the ship didn't comply. So I think there is some question about how much it is actually complied with, but still a positive development.
Absolutely.
Well, look, thanks, Richard. It's been great to chat to you for another episode of Maritime Matters.
Always good.